What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, just welcome. My name is GemmaJade, but today we are going to be discussing more mind-bending encounters with humanoid entities. So I wasn't really sure what to call this video because we've gone over so many different experiences where people have encountered some sort of strange and bizarre humanoid beings or entities, and we've been covering these types of things in these videos on this channel for years. But that's what makes it all the more believable for me, is the fact that we must have gone through and gone over at least 500 or more different types of encounters with all different types of creatures and beings throughout the ages and all cultures, and yet each and every single day, more people are still coming forward with even more sightings and encounters with them. Not to mention, it seems as though every single day as well, someone encounters something completely unknown that no one has seemingly ever encountered before. A lot of the time, the sightings are one-offs, and every once in a while, there will also be some interaction between the witness and the beings, but more often than not, despite falling somewhat under a similar title, these encounters are so incredibly different that it is somewhat hard sometimes to classify which one should go into which videos. It isn't stopping or even slowing down anytime soon, is my point. That's why it doesn't matter to me how many of these videos I need to do, as long as I'm bringing you all accurate information to the best of my ability and showing you all how incredibly and terrifyingly in some cases these types of encounters are. And it often makes me wonder if these different types of humanoid creatures are all coming from other places, or if they're residing a lot closer to home than most of us would ever dare to think or want to know. In fact, it hasn't escaped my attention that tales like the ones we will be discussing here today go back as far as civilization or even time itself. And it's these types of encounters and witness statements that are actually the basis for a great deal of the myths and legends we are all so very familiar with today in all areas of the supernatural and paranormal realms. Also, and as I've talked about somewhat at length in my first book, Missing the Fae Theory, it's where we've gotten a lot of our modern day fairy tales from the somewhat obscure to the very well known. This is where they all come from, these types of interactions that actual people have had with actual entities somewhere at some point in time. It seems to me as though the age of the UFO came into being right around the same time that the modern day UFO era began, which was sometime in the 1940s. And the fact that millions or more of these bizarre and terrifying encounters are all on record, it makes them all the more believable for me and for other people too. Records usually exist when there's been research put into what's being recorded. Not always, but usually. And that includes witness statements and any and all other evidence that doesn't go to contradict what the person or people in question say happened or is happening to them. Before we get started here, though, I do want to give a great big thank you to my patrons, my members, everyone else who supports me in any other way, shape, or form on a regular and consistent basis. You guys keep me going, keep me focused, and are the sole reason I'm able to do something I love so much and reasonably sometimes make a living off of it. Either way, we're all having fun, and I'm just really grateful that you guys are along for this insane ride of my life with me. With that being said, let's jump right in. One of the strangest encounters I've come across in a very long time is also one of the most well-known, at least in recent years, because it happened in 2019. Our witness is a paramedic who was responding to wildfires in the Amazon and who found himself facing off with a 10-foot-tall humanoid creature unlike anything he had ever seen, heard of, or experienced before. We've discussed the researcher and documenter Albert Rosales many times before here on this channel, and he's somewhat well known for investigating these types of cases and bringing them into the view of the wider public. On September 30th, 2019, Paul Parada was working as a volunteer paramedic in the Bolivian region of the Amazon. At around 11 at night, he stepped outside of the medical tent in order to smoke a cigarette, but when he got out there, he immediately noticed something strange a little off into the distance, seeming to be coming towards him as he stood there, watching to see what would happen next. It was too dark for Paul to really make out what it was he was looking at and possibly about to be confronted with or by, but he could see that it was very tall and had a humanoid shape to it. In fact, he later said the first thing he really noticed about the strange figure was how tall it was. As it continued to move closer to him, he also started to see more of what it looked like. He noticed its pale white skin and the fact that it was wearing a very shiny, almost metallic-looking one-piece suit with several silver stripes on it. The strange and bizarre-looking figure had long, shiny blonde hair that went down to a little below its shoulders. By the time Paul had taken all of that information in, the figure was within just feet of him, and he saw that whatever this thing was, it was pressing a towel or some other small type of fabric or cloth up against its waist, looking as though it were injured and trying to apply pressure to the wound in order to stop the bleeding, like we would do as humans. Paul couldn't really yet tell what he was looking at, but with how close it was at this point, being mere feet from him, he saw it looked enough like a human man that his instinct kicked in, and without moving toward it in any way, he called out and asked the person if they needed assistance. The figure, whom Paul now really did think was a normal person who was maybe not so normal, like it was just an odd-looking human being or something, replied to him in perfect Spanish that he was injured and he did need help. Paul immediately turned and went back into the medical tent to get some supplies, and the figure followed closely behind him. Now, I just want to say that while I'm sure Paul had some sort of inkling that something might have been off with this person, he did think he was dealing with a person, despite all of the other strange things that he might have recognized about it. In reality, though, what human being is 10 feet tall? But especially given what Paul was doing out there in the first place, it's like his brain did everything it possibly could to reconcile itself to the fact that someone needed help and that he could possibly provide it, leaving out all of the other strange little details that made it so this couldn't possibly be a human being he was dealing with. So anyway, Paul got into the tent and started looking through his supplies, and he then turned around and asked the humanoid what the issue was, probably so he knew what he would need to provide the best assistance possible to him. Without saying a word to him, the man removed the towels or cloth or whatever they were, and Paul could immediately see that there was a gaping wound in the abdominal area. He began to treat the injury as soon as he saw it, without any hesitation. As he did so, though, he was fascinated and a bit taken aback by the fact that despite all the blood gushing out from whatever that wound was, the clothes were completely unstained, as though not a drop of blood had touched them somehow. It was as though the clothing was made of some sort of waterproof material or something. While treating the injury, he asked the guy how he had gotten it in the first place, and while the figure did answer him, he did so telepathically, which obviously just flabbergasted Paul. The man spoke directly into our witness's mind and told him he had been attacked by a puma while roaming around in the forest. It must have been evident by the look on his face that Paul was terrified, because the figure then said to him telepathically again that he had nothing to worry about or fear, and that no harm was meant toward him at all. Paul wasn't all that comforted by this, but he did his best to maintain his composure and continued helping the figure by treating the wound. Just as he thought things couldn't get any more bizarre that night, Paul was proven wrong, as the night took an even stranger turn after he started treating that wound. Paul finished treating the entity's wound and it then got up to leave. It thanked him for his help, but before it left, it asked him if he would step outside with it for a moment. As they were leaving the tent, the figure spoke into Paul's mind again, saying, quote, "You should not be shocked by what you are about to see," end quote. Paul, I'm sure at this point, was doing his best to keep his composure, and who really knows or could tell how he was feeling or what he was feeling in that moment. But he followed the figure outside, and that's when he saw a large metallic and disc-shaped object hovering several feet away from the tent and only a few feet from the ground. And as he looked at the object, he also saw two tall humanoid figures inside of it. These two humanoids were almost completely identical to the one he had just treated, but instead of having pale white skin, these ones had bright green skin. These green humanoids didn't move the same way as the one he had just helped either. They had a mechanical movement to them, like they were almost robotic, and this struck me as very interesting because we've talked many times here on this channel while going through and discussing these types of encounter stories, the fact that many humanoids that people come across and that we think are more than likely extraterrestrials often do have a very mechanical type of movement to them, and sometimes they even have robotic features. Paul didn't have much more of a reaction than shock and awe while looking at the green figures, but he started to realize that if he stared for too long at them, he became overwhelmed with a really intense sense of dread and fear. After a couple of minutes, the green figures, who had already exited and were kind of wandering around underneath the craft at that point, started making their way in the direction of the entity Paul had just helped, the pale-skinned one. Paul was standing next to that entity, and that entity then started making its way towards the green entities too. So essentially, the pale entity was trying to meet the green ones in the middle. I don't know if it was possibly trying to keep the green ones far enough away from Paul, or I just feel it's strange that it was seemingly trying to block interaction between Paul and the green ones, even though it definitely wanted Paul to see them, if that makes sense. Paul didn't know what to do, so he just stood there watching what was happening. The tall, pale man stopped and turned to look at Paul and shockingly addressed him by his name. Now, Paul had not told the entity his name at all. It hadn't come up at all that entire night, and it really did startle him, even more so than probably anything else that was going on in that moment, because it was very personal. And I don't know, but for me, there is something very personal about a name, that it would be almost terrifying for some out-of-this-world creature to address me in that way. And by all accounts, Paul did feel the same way. The weird part of this is that it seems like the story is a bit incomplete, and I wonder if it's because Paul doesn't remember what was said, because the tall, pale humanoid turned to him, faced him, said his name, and then the next thing Paul remembers is turning and walking back into the medical tent. There's no other interaction. He doesn't remember, as far as I could find, his response to the being. Paul's mind was reeling, but he didn't stick around outside for long enough to see the humanoids or the craft leave. I feel like this was compulsion at play, but who knows? Why would he? The thing turns around and says, "Thank you, Paul," and he just turns without a word, goes back into the tent, doesn't look where they go. If they leave, doesn't see how they get in, doesn't do any of this. I don't know. I believe maybe he was compelled to just turn and walk away, or the memory of him just turning and walking away was implanted and there had been some more interaction that he hasn't yet come up with. This just happened in 2019. So as of filming this, 5.5, 6 years ago. Aside from discussing the incident with his brother, who was also in the same region and also volunteering his own medical skills, Paul really didn't talk about what happened to him that night with anyone else. Not at first, anyway. Over the course of the next few months, Paul couldn't stop thinking about what he experienced, and it was legitimately starting to really drive him a little crazy. He would suffer through extreme bouts of insomnia, and when he did sleep, the dreams were scary and intense, almost like lucid dreaming, but a little bit different. Eventually, he decided he needed to talk more about the experience that night in order to try and work through it, possibly even heal from it. Or, at the very least, he figured talking about it would help him to come to terms with it. Oddly enough, too, Paul had saved the towel/fabric thing that the entity had initially been holding against its wound in order to stop the blood from gushing. But, as of right now, and for frustratingly unknown reasons, no DNA tests have ever been conducted on that material, as far as the general public has been told and knows anyway. What the figure was, what it was doing there, where it came from, etc. All great questions and all still very much unknown. Listen, I know what you're going to say, and I too wholeheartedly believe that DNA and other important tests were actually run on that fabric, and the government knows exactly what those creatures were, and probably the answers to all of the questions and many more that we didn't mention here. But they're never going to tell the general public about it, not if we're being honest, right? Or at least not in my lifetime. The way I see it is a person is smart, but people in groups tend to panic and all sorts of horrible things happen when scared people get together and react to something. So I doubt we'll ever really know the answers to this one. And again, like I said, at least not anytime soon. Another thing I was thinking about as I went through and researched this encounter was how the description of the tall, pale humanoid entity that Paul had initially come across and eventually ended up helping is extremely similar in nature to the abundance of humanoid encounters that came to light in the 1950s from all over the world. Now, before researching into this, I thought the most popular extraterrestrial entity as far as visitations go at that time, meaning in the 1950s and 60s, were the alien greys, as we've come to call them, and that's true for certain areas of the world, and it's also true as far as abductions are concerned. But these so-called Nordic aliens have also been spotted in encounters just as much, if not more, at that time in history. Nordics are typically very friendly and not aggressive at all, and it seems as though they would want to visit with certain humans to be of assistance in offering spiritual guidance to those humans as well. One very important point I want to touch on here is that most of the encounters with Nordic entities are not abductions, but simple interactions and encounters, and usually the human or humans involved doesn't leave physically harmed, even if they inadvertently become psychologically or emotionally damaged a little bit due to the experience like Paul had. That wasn't done on purpose to like torment him and give him insomnia and bad dreams. It was just kind of a repercussion to having such an extraordinary, fantastic interaction with another worldly being. Maybe his humanity, his humanness couldn't handle it. In these contact encounters with the so-called Nordics, the respective witnesses always remain there out of their own free will and were never forced in any way into the encounters, at least as far as I could find. Some researchers and others who have come across these types of encounters wonder if the Nordic beings could possibly be connected to the angelic beings we so often come across in the Bible. If that's the case, then it's possible that these so-called angels in the Bible are actually some sort of extraterrestrial beings made of flesh and blood and who knows what else. But a lot more like humans than we had initially thought, because the being in Paul's encounter was bleeding, even if in a very bizarre way where his clothes weren't getting wet from it, and supernatural beings and entities don't bleed. At the end of the day, though, there's obviously no way of knowing, and it's a huge and incredibly fascinating mystery, at least in my opinion, even as someone who knows angels do exist as a spiritual being and entity, and that they're completely and totally spiritual beings. It's still an odd connection, and I kind of wondered what to make of that. The next encounter first appeared on the paranormal blog site called Tales from Out There, and soon after it was posted, it began appearing all over many other platforms, with word spreading very quickly as to what had happened. The encounter happened on the afternoon of July 6, 2009 in Wiltshire, England, when an off-duty police sergeant was driving along some of the country back roads and minding his own business when he saw something very odd over to the side of the road in one of the many large fields that surrounded it. He slowed down and turned to look in that direction and saw a bunch of what he described as, quote, strange-looking men, end quote, walking around, seemingly wandering aimlessly, as far as he could tell, in the cornfields. At first, he thought that it was most likely just some teenagers hanging out and not bothering anyone, but possibly also sneaking some beers or something in the cornfield. But for reasons he really couldn't explain, he said a, quote, strange feeling, end quote, came over him almost immediately when he laid his eyes on these men. He decided that he needed to pull over and investigate the situation further. As he got out of the car and started to cross the field, making his way towards the cornfield, he said the so-called strange feeling was becoming increasingly stronger with each step toward them he took. As he got even closer, he noticed that each of the men was at least 6 feet tall, possibly even taller. They were all dressed in what looked like white overalls, and they were all staring down and moving around as though they were looking for something on the ground. The officer dismissed the idea that these were just some random teenagers trying to sneak some alcohol, and started thinking of other reasons why these men would just be there doing what they were doing and dressed as they were. He thought that maybe they were some sort of forensics team or something like that, and with that thought, he considered that a major crime had possibly been committed, and since he was off duty, he wouldn't have known, and because it was his job to do so, he started walking more confidently and much more quickly up to the men, eager to try and be of some assistance to them. As he got even closer still, though, he started to hear what sounded like crackling, quote, static electricity, end quote, all around him. He stopped and listened for a moment and realized the strange and out-of-place sounded like it was constantly moving all around him, and with each crackle and pop, the ears of corn would move in the exact spot where it sounded like the static was coming from. It was really bizarre. Realizing something very strange was going on and not really sure what to do next, our witness decided to call out to the men instead of to continue to approach them. He yelled out, asked if they needed any assistance, announced himself and his job title, and asked what they were all doing out there. However, none of the men even looked up, let alone looked in his direction. It was almost like they hadn't even heard him at all, which was impossible given how loud he yelled and how close he was to them at that point. After they seemingly ignored him for a minute or two, with him just standing there wondering what to do next and what he had gotten himself into, really, they all suddenly and in perfect unison stopped what they were doing and looked up. Our witness said it was like they all suddenly became aware of his presence all at once, all at the same time. After stopping for a split second, all of the men, which our witness now counted as 3 of them, started running, quote, faster than any man, end quote, he had ever seen. Within a second or two, they all disappeared into thin air right before his eyes. The static/crackling sound was still very much present, and the ears of corn continued to move all around him with each little popping sound. For the first time since all this started, our witness said the quote-unquote strange feeling turned into outright terror. He turned and ran for his life, fleeing the odd scene as fast as his legs could carry him back to his vehicle. He had to sit in his car for a few moments and collect himself before continuing on with his day, and as he was doing that, about 2 or 3 minutes after he initially entered the car again, he's just started it up and made his way home. By the time he got to his house, he had had a migraine headache accompanied by such extreme nausea that he almost had to go to the hospital. Instead, he rested, and it seemed like whatever it was eventually did go away on its own. Later that same evening, he decided to report the experience to his superior officer, despite how insane he knew it sounded, but the superior refused to investigate the incident any further. There isn't any official report on record of this encounter because our witness wasn't on duty at the time, but he was told by that same superior officer and possibly by others to, quote, just forget about it and move on from it, end quote. However, because of how bizarre and surreal the whole encounter/experience was for our witness, he couldn't stop thinking about and analyzing every single detail of what he had witnessed that day. He started digging up information about the area, just trying to make sense of it all, or at least as much sense as he could make of it, but instead what he found further confused him. In that same area where he'd had his encounter, he saw that a crop circle had recently sprung up at the exact same time almost that he had witnessed all of this. Once he was able to verify that a crop circle had in fact randomly sprung up in that same exact field where he had encountered those men, and either on that same day or a day or two later, the information is a little fuzzy, my sources really weren't clear, he contacted a researcher and expert local to him whose name was Andrew Russell. Now, Andrew Russell looked into the incident and very quickly determined that our witness had in fact come across a trio of so-called tall white extraterrestrials. Russell was unsure whether the aliens had created the crop circle or if they were there investigating it themselves. I wonder, though, if you think back to the incident I just described for you, you'll remember the static electricity sounds he kept hearing all around him and the fact that it seemed to our witness as though the corn were reacting in some way to whatever those noises were. For me, that feels like he was standing there in the middle of that cornfield as the crop circle was forming. The snap, crackle, and pop noises could have been the crop circle springing to life, at least in my opinion. So while the tall whites being there to investigate the circle itself did make some sense to me, due to those additional details, it's more than likely for me that they were in the middle of forming it when our witness came across them. What do you guys think about that? Do you think they were there, the tall whites, or the extraterrestrials, investigating the crop circle or forming the crop circle? Let me know what you think in the comments below, please. Before we move on, I want to call your attention to something we come across a lot here while discussing these types of seemingly random and bizarre encounters with extraterrestrials. That would be the fact that these 3 entities that our sergeant saw were all looking down at the ground as though they were collecting data or otherwise on some sort of strange fact-finding mission here on Earth. We've often discussed people coming across alien forms, mainly in the woods but not always, and other places, who were collecting samples of the soil or water or air in the area, and that's why I wasn't as surprised when I read through the next encounter. In the early morning hours of August 11, 2003, at just a little after 4 o'clock, another encounter involving humanoid entities happened. This time it took place just outside of Strangeness, Poland, and I'm not good at pronouncing, guys, so I don't know. This one comes from the files of Brian Vike, and he obtained the information from a Polish UFO investigator named Tomek Wierzchławik. According to the report, a man named Lech Chasinski was driving himself to work along some backcountry roads as he had done every day that he had went to work for many, many years. He was in his work truck and approached a bridge that he had driven over numerous times before. Everything was perfectly normal and perfectly usual until it wasn't. As he approached the bridge in his truck, a humanoid figure suddenly appeared in the middle of the road, not too far up ahead of him. He focused on the strange-looking and out-of-place figure, trying to figure out what it was and what it could have possibly been doing there in that spot at that time in the morning. The figure was standing there facing his truck with its hand out in a greeting gesture, as he stared at it. Lech also noticed that 2 other identical figures were standing right behind that one, flanking it on either side. He pulled his truck to the side of the road and he turned the engine off, all the while examining what he was looking at and trying to wrap his mind around whatever it was. He saw that each figure was wearing a shiny suit, which he thought looked very similar to the suits astronauts wear here on Earth. More concerningly, though, our witness said he couldn't escape the deepening feeling growing within him that he was witnessing something, quote, disturbingly extraordinary, end quote. Despite appearing human in almost every conceivable way, he knew this was something spectacular that he was seeing, and he couldn't take his eyes off the 3 figures. He said they had 2 arms, 2 legs, stood bipedally, were of average height, etc. He further described their clothing and said that the suits were shiny, but with the appearance of, quote, dull silvery elastic foil that looked puffed out, end quote. Each figure also wore a large helmet with a large black visor that covered where their face would have otherwise been visible. He said that there were, quote, 7 lights in each row, end quote, on their torsos, and the lights flashed all different colors. On their backs, each figure carried some kind of backpack, which some people believe could have actually been some sort of breathing apparatus. Before he even had time to blink, our witness said that one of the figures was outside of his truck's cabin and peering at him through one of the windows. Because of how close the entity now was, he could somewhat see its face a lot better underneath the large black visor on the helmet. He said he could now easily make out, quote, 2 round black eyes, end quote, that were staring directly at him. He was so scared and unnerved at the intensity and look of the eyes glaring at him that he went to try and start his truck up so he could get the hell out of there as quickly as humanly possible. So he sees these eyes glaring at him through the visor and he's like, nope. And he tried to nope out of there, but before he could do so, quote, a beam of light, end quote, came shooting out of the creature's helmet and hit him. He blacked out immediately upon being hit by whatever this was. He came to a few moments later, not understanding what had just happened to him, but with an extreme sense of calm currently washing over him. He also heard a voice at that time inside of his head, and he somehow just knew that it was the creature that had kind of blasted him, speaking to him telepathically. The voice told him that he should not be afraid and also asked if he could hear it clearly. Without understanding how he did so, our witness said he was surprised when he was able to telepathically communicate back to it, telling it that he could indeed hear it, but not with his ears. The figure then started to ask him questions about his truck. It asked, quote, what material, end quote, it was made out of and what type of fuel it used. He answered their questions with his mind and said a look of, quote, great surprise and wonder, end quote, on the creature's face at his responses struck him as unusual. It was just an old truck using usual earthly fuel, right? Gas-powered. But after they discussed the vehicle, the creature almost casually just started telling our witness about the, quote, catastrophic consequences, end quote, awaiting our planet if human beings didn't change and continued on our current course. Our witness couldn't recall anything more specific that was said, but knows an entire conversation, who knows how long, had taken place. One thing he definitely remembered was asking the creature where it was from and the response it gave him. The creature told him, quote, the 8th galaxy is our home, end quote. Now, I did have to look this up because I couldn't just let this go, right? So here's a tiny snippet of what I found. Quote, the 8th galaxy is ESO 444-46, which is the 8th largest known galaxy in our universe. It's classified as a supergiant elliptical galaxy and is believed to have grown to its current size by merging with and absorbing other galaxies, end quote. I looked up whether or not there's known intelligent life on the 8th galaxy and got the answer that, quote, researchers and scientists have calculated that there could be more than 30 intelligent civilizations throughout our galaxy. While direct evidence for alien life is lacking, the commonness of habitable environments in the universe suggests that such life forms may exist, end quote. So a typical and very disappointing non-answer. Right. Thanks, Google. So back to our witness in Poland. He said he had no clue how long the conversation lasted, but when it was over, All three of the humanoid figures just floated up into the air and away from the road, and they went into a disc-shaped craft that had been hovering somewhere nearby. He didn't know if the metallic craft had just arrived or if it had been there the whole time, waiting somewhere nearby throughout the entire encounter. He described it as being at least 100 feet wide and floating approximately 1,000 feet from where he had pulled over and parked his truck. He saw several rows of windows running alongside the upper part of the object, while in the center of the very top there was an, quote, opaque chamber, end quote. He watched as the three figures positioned themselves directly below the craft, and without warning, a, quote, very bright blue-white light, end quote, came from underneath it, end quote, took the beings up, end quote, into it. Within a minute, the figures and the craft were gone. All that remained of it was, quote, colored smoke, end quote, sorry about all the quotes, which our witness said had also warped itself all around the craft as it was taking off into the sky. He watched on in awe as the craft rose up into the air to an altitude of between 100 and 150 feet before slowly moving across the ground, with the smoke following it the whole time and continuing to swirl all around it. It briefly stopped for no more than a second or two, maybe, and then shot up into the morning sky and disappeared. The sound it made was also very strange and, according to our witness, sounded like a cross between buzzing and hissing. He was amazed when he looked to where the craft had been hovering just seconds earlier and saw clear indentations in the crops that made a perfect outline of the spaceship itself. He took several pictures of those marks in the field, and later on, during subsequent investigations into his report, even more photos of those same indentations were captured. Many UFO investigators looked into this encounter and ended up going into this field to see if they can gather additional evidence over the years, and most of them do believe this encounter happened and that Lek is an honest and very credible witness with no reason to lie and nothing he was trying to gain from talking about his bizarre and fascinating encounter. Now we're going to move on to an encounter that, in my opinion, is one of the most insane and thought-provoking that we might have ever discussed here on this channel, and many people agree with me on that one. And honestly, if you're new here, just know that is really saying something, because we have covered some insane entities here on this channel and encounters with them. This one happened on the evening of January 27th, 1978, along the banks of the River Weaver in Cheshire, England. I found an article that gives details of the encounter and that has the witness statements in Volume 26, Number 3, 1980 edition of the Flying Saucer Review by Paul Wetnall and Jenny Randalls. At around 6 p.m. that night, 4 young men were out poaching some pheasant near the river in an area that had come to be known by the locals as the Devil's Garden. And this location, whether by coincidence or happenstance or whatever else, has a lot of strange legends attached to it, along with people who have had many types of strange experiences right there. Because they were out committing a crime at the time of their encounter, none of the 4 men would allow their real names to be used publicly, and they all insisted on anonymity throughout all of it. They are still just a group of 4 anonymous witnesses today. As they looked for the pheasants all around the riverbank and in the woods surrounding it, one of the men suddenly saw what he described as, quote, a strange object, end quote, that looked like it was kind of skimming all along the surface of the water. Now, you have to keep in mind that at this time there had been widespread news reports about a Soviet satellite that had come crashing down onto the ground in Canada. So it makes sense that when he called his friends' attention to the object on the water, they all initially thought they were looking at another satellite falling to Earth, regardless of where they might have thought it had originally come from. They didn't immediately think anything crazy was happening. They watched the object for a few minutes, and as they did, they started to realize that what they were witnessing was something extraordinary and possibly more out of this world than any satellite sent into outer space by a Cold War superpower was here on Earth. They quickly realized that it wasn't falling and had to have been under some sort of intelligent control, as it was moving across the water and hovering above the ground about 20 feet high on top of the woodland. So it skimmed the water and then started moving over and up about 20 feet high over the woodlands. As it passed directly over the 4 men, they heard what they later described as, quote, a light humming sound, end quote, that appeared to be coming from it. Also, as it passed directly over their heads, they said, quote, a strange wind, end quote, also seemed to follow after it. They all said that the wind made them feel fairly sick to their stomachs. From where it flew above them, around 20 feet over their heads, they could clearly see it better than they had when it had been over the water in the woods, and they all described it in the same way later on. It was spherical and had a silver exterior, and they watched in shock as it descended to the ground and landed very nearby to where they were standing. They later said that the object had been approximately 15 feet long across and had multiple lines of flashing lights all around the sides of it. They saw several areas that looked like they could have been windows, and they said, quote, a very strange glow, end quote, could be seen emanating from within the craft. The men said that they could only look for so long at the craft itself, for a moment or two at a time, before they felt forced to turn away because their eyes started to really burn very badly. UFO researchers would later confirm that this had to have been some sort of ultraviolet light, which, as many of you know, our human eyes are not supposed to be looking anywhere near, let alone directly at. The more they looked at it, looked away, and then looked back again, the more, quote, fuzzy looking, end quote, the craft became to them. The fuzziness made them feel like there could be potential radiation or something of that nature all around the craft, and they were more and more concerned the longer they all stood there. But I'm sure it wasn't enough for them to go running away through the woods, because if you think about it at that point, what do you really do in that type of situation? I feel like I would be, just for me, far too curious to just turn and run at that point. But I've been told I'm a different kind of person. So anyway, they did begin to back away from the object very slowly in light of the possibility that they could have been being exposed to radiation poisoning. Before they could turn around and even try to slowly and somehow make their way out of there, they noticed a humanoid figure coming out of the disc-shaped object. It was wearing a one-piece silver suit, somewhat metallic looking, and a large round helmet on its head, and on top of the helmet there was a violet light. The four witnesses stood as still as possible, probably thinking that they didn't want to make any sudden moves or draw any extra attention to themselves in light of how bizarre and terrifying this whole situation had very quickly and suddenly become. It seemed as though the humanoid figure was looking around the area and using the light on top of its helmet to do so. The violet light swung its beam all around the area, eventually stopping on a herd of cows in a nearby field. After a moment or two, the figure turned and got back into the craft, but the men still didn't want to risk drawing any attention to themselves, and so they still didn't move. They were right too, because just a few minutes later, the figure did reemerge from the craft, but this time it had an identical looking humanoid figure following close behind it. They were carrying something between them, and it looked to the men like it was a large silver metal cage. It looked like it was very light because of the ease with which the two figures seemed to be able to carry and handle the cage, and they started in the direction of where a herd of cows were grazing. Can you imagine you come across extraterrestrials in the woods and they go into their craft and come back out with a cage that's seemingly large enough for 4 humans? I don't know what I would do. I probably would have passed out at this point. I mean, I don't know. Either that or would have been trying to somehow telepathically throw my energy and communicate with them. Anyway, the two figures approached one of the cows grazing there in that field, and this cow was with the herd, but more off to the side than any of the others. It was basically standing alone, and the figures immediately went up to it with the cage still between them. It was very clear to the 4 anonymous men watching that something was different about that cow, and it dawned on them that it seemed to be standing there unnaturally still, not moving or even, seemingly at least, breathing or grazing like all of the others. It looked like it had been unnaturally frozen or something, frozen to the spot it stood in, as if it had been paralyzed while just standing up there. The figures placed the cage around the cow and then began to slide some metal discs into place on it. The witnesses began to wonder themselves if the figures were planning on taking the cow with them back to the inside of their ship, or if they were merely doing something like weighing and measuring it and were going to leave it there and possibly put it out of its state of paralysis. They didn't stay to find out, unfortunately for us, and this really did frustrate me a lot when I first read it, because at that moment, instead of waiting to see what happened next, all 4 of the men finally turned and ran away from the bizarre and terrifying scene as fast as they could. They eventually made their way to a bridge that allowed them to cross to the other side of the river, and they got the hell out of there as quickly as possible. They did turn around once and look back in the direction from which they'd just come, but they were unable to see either the humanoids or their craft. One of the witnesses later told the investigators, and I want you guys to bear with me here, guys, because this is maybe more bizarre than most of what we've ever heard, or it's just someone finally admitting the bizarre part out loud. So one of the witnesses told investigators that he had experienced a strange sort of, quote, pulling sensation, end quote, as he fled the scene, as if there had been some sort of, quote, invisible force, end quote, trying to drag him back to the scene. What made this kind of crazy is that he said the force had been trying to pull him back by his testicles. His testicles, of all things. Yes, that is what I said. He stated his testicles were sore for several days after the encounter. It's been almost half a century, and we still have no explanation for what these 4 men witnessed out there that night. My initial reaction was that perhaps they were watching the beginnings of what we've come to know in this community as the cattle mutilations, many of which have taken place in England. And I know that because I did a video on just that, cattle mutilations in the UK, though it ended up being one of the lesser watched videos on my channel, even today. I looked into this theory of mine and found that there had been no reports of deceased or missing cattle in that area in the days and weeks following the men's encounter. Could this have been just another one of some sort of extraterrestrials' strange intelligence gathering missions? You know, like the ones where we always see extraterrestrials creatures gathering soil, water, air samples. Could it be that the cow was taken but that it was returned seemingly unharmed and unchanged before anyone had a chance to notice it was gone? Did they do something else altogether but in the field there so that they didn't have to take the animal with them or harm it? These are all great questions, but as usual, and once again, none have any answers, and no one knows still to this day what the hell those witnesses saw out there. What we do know, what I did uncover, is that these types of sightings became common in that area at that time. Let me know what you guys think about this one too in the comments below, please. What do you think their business was with that cow? Just 4 weeks before the River Weaver encounter we just discussed, so on January 2nd, 1978, someone living in Rainford in the Merseyside region of northwestern England reported seeing a humanoid figure wearing a silver suit. Just a little over 2 weeks later, on January 18th, and in that same region, several school children said that they had all seen, quote, a small UFO, end quote, land on the roof of their school. The kids said that, to their great astonishment, right after the, quote, small UFO, end quote, landed on the roof, they watched as 3 astronauts got out of the craft and walked around the top of the building. They said the astronauts were wearing shiny suits that looked golden in color, but I wonder though, as many other people also do, if the suits were in fact silver, but, you know, on the roof, middle of the day, maybe they were reflecting the sun and therefore looked golden to the children instead. Do you think these other sightings are connected to the River Weaver incident with the 4 anonymous poachers? I don't know, but I wouldn't label it as a coincidence, as many of you well know, and that's for sure. I want to make it known here too that there was a discrete wave of UFO sightings happening in the UK at this exact time, and that several people had also reported having been abducted, having eventually come forward with their stories. Because of everything I just mentioned, it seems as though the River Weaver sighting, as it's come to be called, had taken on an even greater interest and significance with ufologists and other researchers from all over the world. It's still widely discussed, debated, and argued over today. And last but definitely not least for this video, a little less than a year after the River Weaver incident, on November 25th, 1978, on the La Pisana estate in Spain in the town of Gerona, another bizarre encounter with the humanoid did unfold. I brought this one to you here in this particular video because many people have discussed the similarities between it and the River Weaver encounter. This one also happened near water, but it was the Guadiana River instead. At around 3:30 in the morning on the night in question, a man named Manuel Gordillo and 4 of his friends were on a late-night hunting trip and were by the riverside in a eucalyptus tree stalking potential prey. After they'd been there for several hours without seeing anything at all, one of the men called it a night and walked back to the vehicle to rest and wait for his friends. The men who stayed behind would have a night they would never, ever forget. They used very powerful flashlights to scan the woods to try and see if they could spot anything worth hunting, and as they did this, they saw strange red lights somewhere off at a close distance from them in the woods. The men liking them as being similar to rear brake lights in a car, even though it wouldn't have been possible to drive any sort of vehicle that deep into the woods. So the lights being brake lights didn't really make sense at all, even though that's what the men said that they looked like. The men started to move toward the lights and ascertain what they were seeing and dealing with, and as they did so, they quickly realized it wasn't a car's brake lights after all, and that they were having an extraordinary experience. Realizing they were dealing with something beyond their scope of imagination and comprehension, the men quickly turned off all of their flashlights and started to walk slower, becoming much more mindful and cautious about what was up ahead of them and their surroundings in general. They watched the strange glowing lights for a few moments, but then decided they would cross a bridge to the other side of the river to continue hunting. They probably had talked themselves and one another out of thinking this was anything extraordinary after all, with a part of each of them telling them it was best to just leave it alone and continue on minding their own business. Or at least that's what it seemed like to me from what I was reading. During the crossing of the river on a very rickety and narrow, wholly unsafe bridge, Manuel somehow became separated from his friends. He had no idea how that had happened, nor does anyone today, but it did happen, and he suddenly found himself alone out there in the darkness of the night in the middle of the woods with these strange red lights around him. He suddenly realized that he was alone and started to move his flashlight around in order to see if the beam would be helpful in locating his friends, whom he presumed couldn't be too far gone by that short amount of time. When after a minute or two he still couldn't see them anywhere, he turned off his flashlight and started whistling in the hopes of maybe getting their attention that way. It seemed to have worked because within a matter of seconds he saw what he thought were his friends coming towards him, evident by their flashlight beams aimed in his direction and getting closer. Finally, he was able to breathe a bit easier when he saw that it was in fact his friends who had found him, but within a matter of another few seconds he noticed how obvious it was that something strange had happened to them. And by that, I don't know what that meant, because I could not find any further explanation as to what made him feel that way or think that way, or what did happen to them. Something definitely did, as you'll see as we go forward, but they never come back to it in the research, at least as far as what I found. And I did look in depth into this one, like I always do. Before he could ask them what was going on, though, one of his friends turned to him and asked, quote, "Did you see that again?" End quote. Manuel responded that he hadn't seen anything at all out of the ordinary since they all saw the red lights before they crossed the river. His friends all told him they had seen, quote, "more bizarre lights," end quote, since becoming separated from him. The men took a couple of minutes and talked about what to do next, and they decided to split up a little bit. Manuel and another of the hunters in the group named Francisco Lopez Rivera decided that they would head in the direction of the lights, which I guess were once again are still visible in the distance from where they were all standing there. They would investigate further what the lights actually were, while the others in the group would cover them from a distance in the woods. This sounds like a bad plan to me, and because I read these as best I can as I go along in order to have a more authentic thought and reaction to what we're dealing with in real time, I mean, I hope it turns out okay. It's not usually a good idea to split up, unless you're trying to create a diversion or cause a distraction. The men had only taken several steps when the lights blinked on once again. From the distance of where Manuel and his friend were standing, they said the lights, quote, "appeared to be shaking," end quote. They continued to move closer to them, and as they did, more details of what they were actually dealing with began to become more clear. There wasn't just one red light, but several of them, all in a row and all running along the side of a large object. Manuel said that the large object was hovering close to the ground and was a very distinct round shape. They were approximately 100 feet away from the craft at that time, and from that distance, he said he could tell that the lights weren't only red, but all different colors. However, Francisco did offer a different description and said that the object wasn't distinctively circular, but instead was, quote, "similar to a large earthen jar upside down and with a red light on top," end quote. He similarly said, though, that the lights were all different colors too, and he stated further that they were a very strange mix of orange, green, red, and yellow. He said the object appeared to be standing on what looked like some sort of silver legs. Besides all of this, there was something more pressing that both of the men remembered seeing and that all of their intense focus was now on. It was a humanoid figure that was walking in their direction. Manuel said that he could initially only see the bottom half of this mysterious figure, but that it appeared to be very tall, and he could see it was wearing something like boots. Both of the men also heard a strange humming sound that seemed to have been emanating from the humanoid, sort of like it was a human being humming a tune, but not. Francisco was several feet behind Manuel at this point, and he said the figure was wearing a shiny silvery helmet with a visor that was similar to a typical motorcycle helmet. Francisco also said he just somehow sensed that the figure was tall, standing between 6 and 7 feet. That's not inhumanly tall, though. I mean, my husband is 6'5", my grandfather was 6'7", so it's not inhumanly tall, but it is taller than average for a human, including a human male, right? The figure continued approaching them, but by the time it was close enough that they could hear its footsteps, they had both turned and ran back to their other friends who were covering them from within the woods. I don't think those friends were covering them. I think they were watching as quietly as possible and getting ready to flee because this is terrifying. Once the two men reunited with the rest of the group, they all thought it best to just go back to the car and get the hell out of there. That's what they did too. I thought this was the end to this particular encounter, and it was for the moment, but several weeks later on January 14th, Francisco Rivera returned to where they had all been hunting that night in the woods with some UFO investigators. Though it took them a few hours, they did eventually manage to find the location where he and Manuel had been standing when they saw the craft and the tall humanoid approaching them. There was a very clear circular indentation in the grass and other vegetation that had created what looked to be some sort of clearing. Everyone there at the time agreed that the clearing had not been created by any natural means, and that it had indeed been made by the object the two men had seen standing there. They also did find several sets of strange footprints. Although they couldn't determine exactly when the footprints had been made, the investigators found it particularly interesting that they could easily see that who or whatever had made them had likely stood at around 7 feet tall, at least 7 feet tall. This is exactly what Manuel and Francisco had originally estimated by what they saw. The research I have into this particular phenomenon and set of encounters goes on for a lot longer than I initially realized, and this video is already going to be super long. I've been filming for like an hour and 40 minutes now already with all the mistakes and things I have to cut, and it's going to be at least, I think, 45 minutes more than likely. So I have a real life glitch in the Matrix video planned for next week, a shorter video than usual just because of how long and intense the past few weeks have been with these videos and now with this one. But if you all want to hear about similar experiences to the ones we've discussed today, more mind-bending encounters with humanoid entities, I have no problem bringing you a part 2 in 2 weeks. But you have to let me know in the comments below. What are your thoughts and feelings about the encounters we discussed here today? But let me know too, why do you think and feel the way you do? Don't be shy about commenting. I do normally try to read all of them when I can, and I love to see all the different opinions and theories taking shape in my comment section. Let me know what you think, and if you all want a shorter part 2 of this video in 2 weeks. Thanks for watching. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content. If you enjoyed hanging out with me, spread the love by sharing this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure your notification bell is turned on. Check out the description box for some important links, ways to donate to the channel, my PayPal, my Cash App, my Amazon wish list gift link. Donations are how I get paid. You can also leave super thanks in the comments. Just remember, if you donate things like super thanks or during live stream super chat, super stickers, YouTube takes 49% of that revenue from me, and I get it like on the 21st, but only if the 21st isn't a Saturday or Sunday. So PayPal and Cash App do work a lot better, and I'm pretty sure Ghost Dragon CW's Venmo is in there as well. Hit me up on other social media. Facebook is just Gemma Jade. I do have Instagram, but I don't really use it. If TikTok is still around when this video airs on Monday at 11 a.m., check me out on there as well. I'm trying to get 1,000 followers on there so I can go live and try to make some more money. My newest book, Gone Mysterious Disappearances, Volume 4. The link is the first thing you should see in the description box. If you're looking for any of my other books, they're all on Amazon, Audible, Kindle, and paperback. I think most of them, if not all of them, are also included in Kindle Unlimited, but you can go to Amazon and type in Gemma Jade Books to see my whole collection if you can't find the link you're looking for in the description box. Guys, please support the shorts. Just because a short is 10 seconds doesn't mean it took me 10 seconds to make. Normally, it takes me 30, 40 minutes sometimes, right? Normally, I'd say it takes me 10 to 20 minutes to create, 10 seconds. I mean, it does take a lot of memorizing and being on point and on cue, and I just really appreciate the support on that. The likes specifically, sharing them out to people who might think they're funny or interesting or anything like that. I appreciate all the support you guys give me. Think about becoming a member or a patron. If you pledge $20 a month or more on my Patreon, you automatically receive a personal intuitive oracle reading every single month from me as a gift, because I can't really do much with my Patreon right now because it's just me and I'm doing a million different things. Memberships, you can start at $5 a month, and one of the main things I do is pick a member, if you've been a member for 3 months or more, and do a reading for you as kind of like a gift. But also my Friday Night Live Intuitive Oracle, if you're a member, you do not have to pay for the 1-card pulls. I feel like I've been talking for way too long, so I'm just going to say, be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you are amazing. You are capable of great things. You are capable of anything you put your mind to. It's never too late. I believe in you. I got your back. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger. and I'll see you guys next time.